All right, ladies and gentlemen, session 4. This one's entitled Casualties, so we'll talk a little bit about bodies. And it's my pleasure to welcome back Jan McLeod, this is her second appearance for MHHV. You can see her bio, and she's going to talk about Aitape and Wewak. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you.
Let me get that just
Yes, I know. I usually have to get that adjusted. Are we okay? Where's the magic lever? Here we are. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming along and sticking around after lunch. And we got caught short there. I thought we were going to a trip. Thank you to the earlier speakers who dealt with this campaign as well, because now I can use all of that military history context because we've got a bit of an idea. So I've still got some lovely PowerPoint slides I put together. Well, I'll put them up. But I just had that as background to give some context about the military. I guess the main points I wanted to make about the military was in terms of how it impacted the casualty numbers, because we're talking about the strategies and tactics and whether it was an unnecessary war or whether it was mopping up or whatever, or basically the medical people were left to mop up with the bandages and the dressings, and it could be unnecessary and you've killed the guy on the front line and you're the guy trying to look after them and patch them back up again. So I think just looking at the medical perspective gives it that human touch. So I'll just go through that a bit. I think the medical perspective highlights the impact of these decisions on the personnel. As I say, the decisions necessarily affect a range of areas, including the preparation, the supply, the treatment, and the casualty evacuation methods, as well as how many medical personnel we allocate to that role, the levels of training. Planning for this campaign was impacted by uncertainty regarding Australia's ongoing role in that wider war across the Pacific, and also by the important questions that we discussed about what any post-war peace might look like. So in terms of the controversies, I have to say that I referred to controversies plural, and I had intended to cover a broad range. But the more I looked into it, there was one in particular that proved more complex and far-reaching than the other topics that I'd intended to touch on. So this is about the malaria casualties, an epidemic that broke out in the Aitape Wewak area, and and the development of Aitape and the controversy that arose around the treatment. So I was going to concentrate on that, the impact on the men of the 6th Division. Again, studying the responses, the official responses to this epidemic, illustrates the complex interplay between military strategy, medical science, and the human factor in wartime. So I'm just going to briefly touch on the other issues that I didn't mention, I was intending to study closely. But basically it was the questions of supply, treatment and evacuation. Most of the challenges encountered in this campaign, the Aitape Wewak campaign, was similar to those confronting all medical units that operated in the rugged environments of Papua and New Guinea, namely the difficulties posed by the extreme terrain and the weather, which challenged all the logistics, and more specifically, some of the controversies, both in this campaign and also most of them really, but in Kokoda as well, arose around a perceived or real lack of priority given to the medical aspects of the campaign. So I guess an example of that is in the initial medical planning, a section of the 314 Australian Field Ambulance had been scheduled to arrive at Aitape. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I've been stressing about it all day. I go Aitape, Aitape. Can I say Wewak? That'd be easier. You know where I mean, right? So originally this section of this field ambulance had been scheduled to arrive during the first phase, but their priority was downgraded in accordance with shipping allocations and prioritisations. So just one result of that decision was that the Australian casualties that were incurred during these early weeks were hospitalised and treated in American medical installations. So just to give you an idea of the sorts of things I was going to be looking at, how those sort of incidents impacted on the medical. So I'll just quickly get through. The next section is going to look at what the campaign involved. So just the map which we've got a bit of an idea now of where we're talking about, that coastal strip and then inward towards the mountains in North New Guinea. And then it was also touched on in the earlier presentation, I think it might have been by Justice Brereton, about how the instructions that were given took on a bit of a different tone from the original. Sturdy's interpretation of the original idea. I guess there we're thinking about, the Americans were sort of just holding, they were told to sort of just hold it, not necessarily aggressively pursue, but that did change as we went on. So this was the original instructions that Blamey issued. And then Stevens and Sturdy, you can see especially this area highlighted in red, to seize every opportunity for the destruction of the forces. So a slightly more aggressive tone to that. And then just their basic objectives. And then I've just listed the land forces over there to give you some idea. So we know the brigades that we were talking about, mainly the 16th, 17th and 19th brigades from 6th Division. There was also the 3rd base sub-area as well. They took over from the Americans who had landed, well, in the general area in April 44. And then they, of course, were taken out to carry on to the Philippines. So there were issues around the shipping there too. There was arguments that priority was given to loading the American ships to take off for the Philippine campaign at the expense of unloading medical supplies, etc. for the Australians. So that was another of the controversies I was going to touch on. So I'll just flip straight to the medical, if that's okay, because I think we've got a bit of an idea about the campaign generally. So a few weeks after the arrival of the main body of the Australian soldiers in November 44, the Australian Army Medical Service units were deployed to the Aitape Wewak to support the fighting troops. The predominant units were the field ambulance. They were responsible for the forward treatment of sick and battle casualties as well as for casualty evacuation. They, in the traditional fashion, as in the previous campaigns, they established a series of regimental aid posts, advanced dressing stations, main dressing stations, where initial medical treatment, including surgery, was administered. And then casualties that were suffering from more serious injury or illness were evacuated back towards the casualty clearing stations, and if necessary, back to the 2nd 11th General Hospital. That was at Aitape. Medical personnel included orderlies, nurses, surgeons, anaesthetists and dentists. And women. The idea that there were a lot of women at the front line in the Kokoda campaign is a bit of a misleading. They sort of came in towards the end of things, and a lot of that was to do with the attitude of the Australian government and Australians generally of not putting the women in the front line. We had a different attitude towards sending the women to Papua New Guinea against the Japanese than we did towards sending them into the Middle East against the Germans. But we did send women here. They arrived via amphibious vehicle in November 44. It was only a very small group. They were initially tasked with overseeing that transfer of 150 Australians from the ones that were kept in the American medical units. They were transferred over, and the nurses helped with that. They were sent to the 104 casualty clearing station. Interestingly, I thought, though most of the nurses were actually veterans who'd served in the Middle East, New Guinea and the islands, many of the newspaper reports and the official photographs focused on their recreation time, spent sewing and ironing, or adding their special touches such as flowers to the wards. But I'm just saying, they were there in amongst it all. They were right amongst it all with the surgery, yeah, as well as ironing and sewing. So for a campaign that the official medical historian, Alan S. Walker, described as having begun largely as training for other and wider ventures, was his quote. The casualty numbers for the Aitape Wewak campaign are sobering. So the figures vary, and I've got a bit of a note there about the figures, but if we say over 1,500 battle casualties, and amongst that we had the killed in action, presumed dead, died of wounds, and then the wounded or injured in action. And then if we look at the disease casualties, which I think was mentioned, I think might have been Justice Brereton again, it's just massive, you know. And that was the pattern in all of these wars, and probably wars generally actually. But if we look there, there's a breakdown of that. Dysentery, skin disease, over 7,000 classified as other, and I haven't yet found a definitive answer for other, but it included things like typhus, hookworm, respiratory illnesses, everything from the flu to infections. But this was the stunning figure. So that's why I'm sort of concentrating on this aspect, because there was a lot around that was quite controversial. So of this number of casualties, over 16,000 of disease, staggering that almost 40%, oh there it is, 40% were caused by malaria. And again, to reference an earlier paper, Edward Kenner VC, who was mentioned in this presentation, was one of those who contracted malaria. He got it in December 44 and again in March 45. And if you're familiar with the Australians at War archives, the interviews series, there's an interview with him, and he talks about, very colourfully, talks about the malaria outbreak and the Aitape treatment that was used. So they're fantastic, those interviews. So to a more detailed look at the malaria epidemic and the controversy that arose around its outbreak, this is a pretty long quote from the official medical historian, but the key points that he notes are its swift onset. The outbreak was quite swift in onset, very serious. The cause of it was unknown at the time, which I don't mean the cause in terms of it was transmitted by the mosquitoes, but the cause in that we thought we had it covered. We didn't expect this malaria outbreak. And yeah, he also talks about the irony of it in that last paragraph, because the period he's talking about in December, when a smallish outbreak came about, we thought we'd sort of stopped on it early enough, and then he calls it ironic that once we'd introduced the strictest precautions so far, we still had this very big outbreak. So, because we're not all experts on malaria or Aitape, I'm not going to go through all the details, but just a few stop points about the background to the research with malaria, about how it was spread, that the name actually comes from the idea of bad air, and the idea that that's how it was spread until we figured out that actually it was the mosquitoes that were transmitting it, or more specifically the Plasmodium parasite that lived in mosquitoes, and that's how it was transmitted. And then the symptoms, we may be familiar with reading about, or may have experienced malaria itself, how it progresses through the body, what the symptoms involve, from quite mildish to very serious. And then the treatment, basically in those three broad areas of preventative, which is not real practical in the middle of the jungle, the clothing and the nets, and keep covered and apply all the repellents, etc. The therapeutic, which was initially quinine and then the Aitape, and then the eradicative with chemicals or with spraying DBTs and that sort of thing, or drainage of the crater holes, etc. So similarly for the Aitape, just again quickly to look at the development of Aitape, just looks at how it was developed through the 20s and 30s. Some of the side effects from it are interesting, and then there were concerns about its long-term toxicity. So they struggled to find the correct dose. They were worried about too high a dose causing all these problems, but lower doses obviously not covering it well enough. So the solution they came up with was to give a bigger priming dose and then keep everyone on a maintenance dose. So it became necessary to come up with an alternative to quinine, which had been used since the at least the 17th century. Because of the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies in 42, there was a global shortage of the cinchona plant, which is where quinine was derived from. So that accelerated the development into the Aitape. So by 43, the Allied troops in the Southwest Pacific were being treated with Aitape, and by the following year it was recognised as an effective drug for malaria suppression and was being mass-produced in the US and in Britain. So what was Australia doing about it? Under MacArthur's direction, Brigadier Neil Fairley, now this is a name for a committee, ready? The US-Australian Combined Advisory Committee on Tropical Medicine, Hygiene and Sanitation. So that formed an experimental group, malarial experimental group in Cairns in 43 to further the research. The objective was to find a causal prophylactic, which focused on killing the parasite before it could be transmitted from the liver into the blood, through the bloodstream. So I don't know if you're familiar with anyone familiar with these experiments that were conducted? They're just terrific when you read about them. These guys are amazing. So we recruited hundreds of volunteers, when I say we, the Army, to undergo rigorous trials, and some of the volunteers again share their experience on those interviews, which are fascinating to hear what they went through. So that's just some photographs of what the facility looked like. And then as knowledge became more widespread about what they went through, we decided they were not only human guinea pigs, but they were actually heroes for going through what they did for these experiments. So they were basically, because of fears that there would be breakthrough cases fighting up in New Guinea, they conducted the research by breeding the larvae, by experiencing huge amount of mosquito bites. You can imagine, had to lie there. One guy talks about you just have to will yourself not to move and just to let them bite you. Then they would come down with malaria more often than not, and they were, the criticisms that the experiments weren't conducted in a warlike environment led to the Army imposing harsher conditions, so to more closely replicate the conditions. So this is what they moved on to. They heavily infected them. They subjected them to more strenuous exercise. They subjected them to extreme temperatures. They gave them injections of adrenaline and insulin, and they were hosed down with cold water and forced to sleep in the wet clothes. This last spot, they were placed in the freezer at the Cairns Meat Works, and they were exposed to temperatures of between 0 and -9. Oh, buggers. So it was reported that despite all of this, none of the volunteers developed overt malarial attacks as long as they remained on the daily suppressive dose of Aitape, which was the key. That was the key to that section. So as a result of all that, this is Fairley, and he held a conference with all the officers to share the results of the experiment. There's some very detailed papers written on this, which a lot of it went over my head, but Sweeney is a guy who's written a lot about this sort of thing. And so he shared the results and basically highlighted that they'd settled on 1 tablet per day, but it had to be taken every day. That all of the cases of the falciparum, which was the malignant, as they used to call it, and the vivax were suppressed while taking Aitape. They reckon they could cure the more serious one if it was continued. There were relapses, but these last few points, they had to ensure complete compliance, and the officers had to see that the Aitape had been taken, and they had to have therefore really strict supervision, and the officers were made responsible to make sure that that happened. So basically, they were saying it'll be a self-inflicted wound if you end up with malaria. It must be a lax procedures if you end up falling sick to it, because we've done everything that we can do to it here. So the official responses to this, that's the head of the Australian Army Medical Services, Burston, often known as Ginger Burston. I think he had red hair. So Blamey came out fully supportive of all these changes, said any neglect to comply will be treated seriously, will be punished accordingly. Burston said, we've shown you this is all going to work, so it's purely training and discipline, especially the taking of Aitape, so basically the ball's in your court. While this was all happening, Fairley, who oversaw all of these experiments, he embarked on a number of overseas trips to spread the word, presented his research, and Burston also travelled extensively, enhancing the reputation of the medical service internationally. So it's probably too small to read there, but he's basically saying to the US authorities in Washington that our medical service leads the world in the field of tropical medicine, that the work of this research group was one of the most outstanding contributions in the effort, And back home, initial results were promising. Malaria rates amongst the Australian troops in the Southwest Pacific fell to 26 per 1,000 per annum by late 44, which was the lowest rate recorded amongst non-immune troops in hyperendemic tropical areas. But while Aitape was effective in suppressing the malignant type of malaria, there were relapses of the less severe type. But the strong support and responses from those in command are important to note when we consider their attitudes in the face of the epidemic that followed. So I'll just move on to what that epidemic looked like.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, so progress. It was uneven the way it was spread. We set up boards of investigation to try and find out what was going on. The troops in the coastal area obviously was subjected to much more severe doses, and so it was decided to increase the dose, but it was only temporarily increased. So some of them remained on the higher dose until the end of it. The numbers went up by the end of January. It continued to go up through that first part of the year. You can see how many cases there were, but still our authorities were saying it's still down to you guys because you're not taking it properly or you're not supervising with the men taking the Aitape correctly. So there's the numbers there for the numbers of the people subjected and soldiers subjected to the malaria, despite this Aitape that was supposed to keep it all under control. So the key points, I'll just go through this quickly. They were still subjected to it wherever they were fighting. They weren't affected equally. The variation was consistent with the climate, the terrain. The predominant type was malignant, and the discipline wasn't flawless, but the guys were saying, we're basically doing our best, we're trying to stick to it. The officers were saying we're supervising, these guys are still getting it, there's something wrong. So the controversy arose when the officers wouldn't change the regimen of the Aitape. They were saying there must be an X factor, there must be something gone wrong here. You guys aren't taking it properly, it's not our fault, just stay on the one tablet, and more people were subjected to the malaria. Further experiments undertaken later proved there was another strain of malaria up there that was resistant. So, but the thing is, the controversy arose from that because the men themselves, they would not back down on it. So the official historian and medical campaign basically said the ramifications of that were deeply affecting of the soldiers because they felt they weren't being trusted to do the right thing, that the blame is put on them. Again, I'm trying to speak to them. I've just gone notes out the window. Right, so this was the main reason why they were sticking to it. There was a big fear that if we admitted there was a problem, that there would unleash this idea of indiscipline, and that there might be some sort of revolt by the men by saying, see, you're giving this, you need to do the experiments properly, you're leading us up the garden path, basically. So, yeah, they were worried about morale. Even the people working in the experiments, like McLeod, who was very well recognised and was a friend of Fairley's, said Neil Fairley would not admit that the Aitape tablets could fail because it might weaken discipline elsewhere. So he thought it was justified maybe at the time, it was tough on the This is a man who's my hero, and I'll have to just mention him quickly. Dickie Smibbit, his name was, and he was a fighter for the men. And he said the lessons to be learned is that such people are scientists, and if they get themselves mixed up with propaganda and lose their approach, much harm can be done to everyone. That was a summary of his views. Basically, he said you should have been reviewing this dose and seeing that there was a problem and we need to increase the dose. But he criticised the lack of transparency amongst all the research. He didn't have a fondness for General Stevens. He thought that he should have stood up for his men more. And I'll just quickly, this is the second last slide, I promise. He just says, it's apparent to me, this is in return to the official historian asked for opinions about how he was handling the campaign in his histories. Smibbit said, it's apparent that you do not realise the damage that was done from this controversy, and he hopes when the next war comes, those who served at Aitape Wewak are too old to take part in it. Those who are serving don't delve too deeply into the attitude and advice given by such people as Fairley. Otherwise, the respect built up in 2 world wars will be badly shaken. So he gave him a serve, and at the time he gave him a serve. He wanted to be paraded, he wanted to take the complaints further, but they said, no, this is what we're doing. So they used to line them up, make you take the tablet, there was evidence they took it, still the outbreak happened and no one would review it overall. So basically this quote summarises it. I think in the light of history it seems just that the 6th Division should be exonerated from the charge, but lack of discipline in itself was the major cause of the epidemic. So I'll finish.
Well done, Jan. Beautifully on time.